Hello, my name is Garn Jensen. I'm part of the Nakusa High School News. We are an independent study group for the Nakusa School District, and this is part 2 of 4 for our interviews with the 70th and 72nd candidates for the assemblies. Please enjoy. Hello, Mr. Holbrook. Nakusa High School News appreciates you for taking time out of your day to come for this interview. How are you today?
I'm just fine. The weather's wonderful out there. It's a great fall day. Looking forward to it.
Why don't you start off by telling us a bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Mark Holbrook. At this point in my life, I'm a retired educator. Started out, I was born and raised in, for the most part, in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Went to parochial school and then Sheboygan North High School. After I graduated, I started my college career at UW Sheboygan Center. Unfortunately, I was majoring in sheephead at the time and not doing real well, basically because I didn't know, what I was there for. Long about November, I got a draft notice from Uncle Sam saying I'd been selected. I was lucky, right? My dad had been a career Marine, so I pretty much knew what the military was about. And when I went home that weekend to think about it, I decided rather than going to the registrar's office and getting a student making sure my student deferment was active, I just went back and decided I would accept the draft. So on February 14th, St. Valentine's Day of 1966, I took the oath and entered the United States Army. Went through basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and then was transferred to Fort Knox for armor training. And while I was there, I was offered Officers Candidate School and accepted that. I was commissioned as second lieutenant in 1967. And then after that, I went to rotary flight school. I was qualified as a helicopter pilot and came back to Fort Knox briefly, but ended up in Vietnam for 1 year from October 68 to October 69. Flew light observation helicopters in an air cavalry unit, which is it's kind of like being the worm on the end of the line. You fly low and slow on top of the trees looking for enemy activity, and usually they found you. Went back to the United States after my 1 year tour, taught aviation weapons at the Armor School, and then shortly thereafter got out of the Army and came back to Wisconsin to UW Madison, which at that point in time was considered to be one of the top 10 public universities in the world. Graduated in 1975 with a degree in meat and animal science, and then my wife and I headed for Montana, Wyoming, where I cowboyed for a while. I was trying to get some experience in ranch management and things like that. But when our son was conceived, we decided to move back to Wisconsin because working for $600 a month and half a steer once a year, which just wasn't going to cut it raising a family. So I came back, took a job with Frito-Lay, worked as a processing manager, packaging manager, and eventually was promoted to shift manager and then to the farm division prior to leaving industrial management after 4.5 years. I went back, got certified to teach agriculture, and took a position at Tri-County High School, which brought me to central Wisconsin, and I taught vocational agriculture for 3 years. While I was there, I reactivated the FFA chapter there and worked quite extensively with my FFA president, a young man who was bound and determined to leave central Wisconsin because he really didn't see much of a future for himself. So I worked pretty heavily with him during that whole senior year of his to get him into a diving school out in Seattle, Washington. He wanted to become an underwater diver and construction worker. Unfortunately, after he graduated and as the summer went on, a few things happened in his life, and he ended up taking his own life. And that hit me pretty hard after working with him as much as I did. And I spent the following year continuing to teach, but making plans to go back to the University of Wisconsin in Madison and getting a master's degree in educational psychology with an emphasis on adolescent depression and suicide. I then took a position with the Pittsfield School District and worked there for 10 years as a school psychologist, working with children that had disabilities and needed some assistance in learning, and working with adolescents who obviously showed symptoms of depression and suicide, and developed a student peer group there that was kind of like the first line of defense, because you talk to your friends, and if you know what depression looks like or sounds like, and you have some training, you're actually the first person that could report that and get that person some help. After working for 10 years as a school psychologist, I transferred into administration and worked as a high school principal at DC Everest for the final 14 years of my career. I retired in 2011, and I became politically active, real concerned with what the governor and the Republicans were doing to the state of Wisconsin, and it wasn't until May of this year that I made the decision to go ahead and jump in and run for office. So that's the present.
How did your service in military affect the way you're running, since you were in there for 6 years, and you also have 25 years of educational fields? How that help you be an effective representative?
Well, one of the things that happened to me in Officers Candidate School is you learn a lot of the skills needed to lead people. You couple that with firsthand experience. I was platoon leader in Vietnam. So I had 10 warrant officers and 2 lieutenants working with me in the Aero Scout platoon. And then coming back to the Armor School to teach and working with 2 other veteran pilots to develop a curriculum for aviation weapons within the Armor School, it really teaches you a lot of leadership skills and management skills. And then, that's further developed in working for Frito-Lay as a manager. I mean, civilians have a different way of managing and leading people than the military does. So when you combine those 2 things together, you really start to develop a pretty refined way of dealing with people, and recognizing that people need to come first. One of the first lessons I learned at Frito-Lay is the president of PepsiCo was coming for a visit, and they do that periodically, look at the condition of the plant and talk with the management staff. And the president of PepsiCo had all the managers in the plant together in the conference room, and he said, just threw out a question like, who do you think is the most important person in the company? And of course, a very young, inexperienced first-line manager said, well, of course you are. And he said, no, let me show you who's the most important. And he gathered everybody up and took us into the break room, and he just kind of swept his hand across, and he said, these are the most important people in the company, because they're the product, they're the people that make the product that we sell for a profit. And if you don't keep them happy, we won't have a quality product. And that made a pretty deep impact on me in terms of who really is important and what the role of a manager is. It's not to force people to do work, it's to work with people to bring out the best in them. And I think I took that with me into administration in education. That the job of an administrator in education is not to harangue teachers and get them to do things. It's to work with them, to be an observer and reflect back to them what they're doing in the classroom, with the hopes that they too will recognize that there are things that they can do to refine their techniques and their presentation and make better teachers out of them. So I think all of those things combined, as an observer of politics, helped me formulate ways that we can better deal with our responsibility to the citizens of the state of Wisconsin.
What are your thoughts on the new Wisconsin voter ID laws, which have gained national attention in recent weeks?
Voter ID is a solution looking for a problem. I mean, I was listening to public radio just about a week ago, and they were talking about Texas' experience. That the governor and the attorney general were concerned about voter fraud, and they had interviewed the attorney general of the state of Texas, and I think this is true. It's true across the country as well. They had one conviction for voter fraud in the last, like 20 or 30 years. And when public radio, National Public Radio, had done an investigation on that case, what they found was it was a young man who had moved back to his community and wanted to vote, and went to vote on the day he was supposed to. And they asked him his name, and he told them his name. And they asked him for an ID card, and he took out his driver's license and he gave it to him. And they checked him off, and he voted. Well, unbeknownst to everyone, his father had exactly the same name and had died previously. And so when they asked him his name and he told them, they assumed that it was his father, he assumed that he had previously registered, and so he ends up getting convicted of a crime that he did not intentionally commit. And I think that's true across the nation. When you look at the instances of voter fraud, you end up with such a minuscule number that you have to ask yourself, all the political hay that's made of that and what it's costing people and governments to give everyone an appropriate ID card according to the law, it's a waste of money. I mean, it costs you to purchase the license, right? It costs the state to formulate the license and make the licenses, and it's just a waste of money. And I'm not very fond of the person I'm about to quote, but Ronald Reagan once said, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." Well, they ought to follow their own advice.
Well, public education has seen decreased funding the past few years, while opposite is true for voucher schools. Is public funding for voucher schools the route we should be taking in Wisconsin?
Oh, I don't believe that even for a minute. I mean, essentially what's happened in the last 5 years is the state has withdrawn $2.5 billion from public schools in the state of Wisconsin. As a school psychologist, one of the things you become very familiar with is data. I mean, that's what you make decisions on. You do some testing, you do some interviewing, and to the best of your ability, you use that data to formulate a theory about what's wrong and how to fix it. Well, when I started as an assistant principal, I was put in charge of testing at DC Everest. And you start taking a look at those numbers, and what you find out is the state of Wisconsin has always ranked 1, 2, or 3 in the nation in terms of our test scores. We test more of our students voluntarily in the ACT program than any state in the nation. And we always end up as 1, 2, or 3. So that says we're doing a pretty darn good job of educating our young people and getting them ready for whatever it is they choose after high school. So now we end up with conservative Republicans in our state telling us that we're not living up to expectations. Okay, we can always do better, but there's not a manufacturing facility or a corporation in this country that takes one of its best manufacturing facilities and takes money away from it and gives it to some entity that they know nothing about. I mean, what we should be doing is saying, okay, if we've got problems, let's take a look at those problems seriously and start working with them to develop a better process so that our kids can end up with better educations. But what has really happened is a series of acts that are very anti-education have been passed in this state, and as I said, $2.5 billion has been withdrawn from the program, and $865 million have been transferred to public entities that we know nothing about and we have no strings attached. Those charter schools, those private charter schools that are receiving your parents and my tax dollars to educate children have no strings attached. They don't have to do the same testing that public schools do. They don't have to create a report card that public schools do. And in too many instances, we've seen them pop up in the middle of the night and leave in the middle of the night and take Wisconsin tax dollars with them. I don't think that serves the public well. I don't think it serves the economy of the state of Wisconsin in the long term. So I think vouchers are, again, a solution to a problem that never existed to begin with.
America is currently spending more than they are making and is currently having to pay interest on our debt. What do you plan to do to help remove the debt that we have?
Well, I think, number one, we have to stop trying to convince our population that government is bad and that they're taking your money and they're spending it on things that shouldn't be spent. Now, to a degree, I can't disagree with the fact that we're spending money that could be used elsewhere. But first of all, what we have to remember is this government was created by our founding fathers 240 years ago when the current Constitution was put into effect. And if you look at the philosophy that they used to design that, you have to look no further than a book like the John Locke's Second Treatise on Government. And he talked about the responsibility of government and how government should be formed. Essentially, we have God-given rights and responsibilities, by the way. And that when people, give up some of those rights to create a government that to serve them, they have every right to change that government if it's not serving them. But when it is, that's when we have to recognize that in order for government to provide the services that it is bound to provide by our Constitution, we have to pay for it. What Republicans have been telling us for 20, 30 years now is that we can cut your taxes. Well, look at what's happened. We've cut taxes, we fought 2 wars without raising money for that, and we have a deficit that now sits at about $20 billion or $20 trillion. Who is going to come along and pay that debt except the American taxpayer? So we have to recognize that if we like the roads we drive on, if we like the schools that our children are educated in, if we want a secure net to protect people who are for one reason or another economically depressed or retired, we've got to pay the taxes to pay for that. No sugar daddy is going to come in and say, oh, you have all this debt, let's erase it, I'll pay for it. It's not going to happen. So, I think we have to recognize what government is for. Government has one purpose and one purpose only, and that's to serve the people. And, those services cost money, and we have to pay for it through our taxes. Now, do we want to make sure that's done efficiently? Absolutely. I mean, we spend more money on defense in this country than all the rest of the developed world combined. We should be secure. We should have a good defense. But I think there's an awful lot of waste in those kinds of programs. There's an awful lot of waste in programs that say we need voter IDs. What's happening to our infrastructure? It's crumbling. When we cut that much money out of public education, I can guarantee you, when I was an assistant principal at DC Everest High School and we had a vacancy, we would get up somewhere in the vicinity of 80 to 90 to 100 resumes for teachers to fill that position. Talking to the principal there today and talking to the superintendent in Sparta and Toma, they get less than 20 resumes to fill a position, and many times they end up having to get into a bidding war for that teacher. What does that mean long-term for the state of Wisconsin?
What is your stance on the Affordable Care Act, commonly referred to as Obamacare? Should the federal or state governments be involved in health care?
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of those services that nobody can provide to the people better than the government. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel to do that. You have to realize that the Affordable Care Act is not what everybody wanted. 68% of the population, when they were discussing health care at the national level, wanted a single-payer system, something very similar to Medicare. What did we get? We got a compromise between Republicans and Democrats, and the reason we got the Affordable Care Act was because it was so similarly designed to what Mitt Romney signed as governor of Massachusetts. So here we have what is essentially a Republican program signed by a Democratic president as a result of a compromise, and the Republicans don't like it. Well, like I said, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Right now the pharmaceutical companies and the health insurance companies are running our health care, and what's happening to the cost? It continues to go up. Germany has a program where they basically have allowed insurance companies to be involved in the process, but they've said they can't earn more than 4% profit. So the only way for an insurance company there to make more money is to provide better services, so that people go from one company that's not providing good service to another company. So what you end up with, instead of just taking money and really not providing great service and not disclosing what's going on to the public, you have insurance companies that have to fight for their 4% profit, and that has made their system better than ours.
Wisconsin's minimum wage is currently $7.25 an hour, yet one MIT study found that in order to maintain a normal standard of living, one adult needs to earn a little over $10 an hour. What are your thoughts on the idea of raising the minimum wage?
Well, I do not like the terminology to begin with, minimum wage, because what it says is that some people just aren't worth what other people are. And, you know, from an economic perspective, there may be a little bit of truth to that. But what really has to happen is we have to raise that minimum wage up to what is called a living wage. So that, you know, somebody who is working 40 hours a week has enough money to provide themselves and their families with, you know, adequate health care, adequate living, you know, a roof over their head, clothes, food, and, you know, the necessities of life. Look, nobody, no family spends more of their disposable income than the lower 20%. You know, so when we hear Republicans saying they're going to reduce taxes, you know, for the wealthy, it doesn't work in favor of our economy, because the wealthy, I mean, how many Cadillacs can you buy? How many houses can you buy around the world? You know, and a billionaire who, you know, who has his taxes reduced, you know, doesn't put any more of that into the economy than they already have. Somebody who is at a living wage, and I don't know exactly what that should be, an economist could tell you, but let's say it's $15 for a hypothetical number. They're gonna, after they pay taxes, everything that's left over is called disposable income. They're going to spend 100% of their income, basically, on the necessities of life. So for every dollar they earn and put into the economy, we know economically that that probably multiplies itself 8 times. So rather than looking at trickle down, where we cut taxes at the top, hoping that it will trickle down to, you know, our families, the middle class and below, what we ought to be practicing is trickle up. Let's give people at the bottom a living wage so that they can survive and prosper, and eventually the profits from the business entities will in fact, you know, get some of that money.
CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations, have been a hot button issue here in central Wisconsin due to their potential effects on the environment. Could you share your thoughts on the issue?
Yeah, you know, I'm not anti-business in any way, shape, or form. I mean, it's an entity that has to exist so that we can, you know, buy the goods and services that we want from private industry. But you know, no matter what industry you're talking about, there have to be regulations that affect that industry that literally protects the individuals that have to live around it. In the case of CAFOs, what we end up with is, instead of you know, the family farmer who has 100, 150 head and is holding it together as best they can for the benefit of their families and the consumer, we have animal feeding operations that have 3, 4, 5,000 animals at a time. And the liquid manure that those animals produce is huge. You know, if that CAFO exists on clay, and they're spreading it as they should, clay is a very fine filter. You can, you know, kind of liken it to a HEPA filter that you might put in your furnace. You know, it as the water seeps through, it filters out the particulate matter and actually does a job of cleaning the water before it hits the water table. On the other hand, sand is like a sieve. I mean, imagine, you know, taking all of that manure and putting it through a sieve. Well, only the big stuff gets caught, but the liquid that is carrying chemicals that, you know, are going to do damage to our water supply go right down into the water table. So there has to be different regulations based on the soil type that they're using, and, you know, the kinds of animals that they're raising and feeding and sending to slaughter or getting the milk from. So, you know, it's not like one size fits all. I think we would be better served if, number one, we had regulations that were adhered to and enforced by the Department of Natural Resources, and if we limited the number of animals that were in CAFOs to something that is much more manageable than we have right now. You know, the other aspect of CAFOs is they really work against the family farm, because they're creating such massive amounts of product that they're using, that they really drive the price down in localities, and family farms can't compete. So we have to make some decisions. Do we want the family farm to continue to exist? Do we want our water, which is precious, to continue to be as pure as the driven snow? Do we want our lakes and streams polluted by runoff from combined animal feeding operations? Those are decisions that the people of the state of Wisconsin have to make, and I think for the most part, what you see is Democrats have always been in favor of protecting the environment and protecting the family farm. And on the other side, we have conservative Republicans who think that business is all that counts, and we should make sure that they're secure, and then the rest of us will benefit from it. There's a whole other argument about economics, and business will tell you that we need to be protected and we need to get our way because we create jobs. That's not true. Who creates jobs? Do you know?
Small businesses.
Small businesses don't create jobs. There's only one thing that creates jobs, and if the first course you're going to take in economics, they're going to tell you what that is. Demand creates jobs. If I'm a small business owner and I'm selling widgets and nobody wants widgets, how long is my business going to last? It'll go under shortly, right? Small businessmen provide services and goods based on the demands that the public has for it. So who do we care more about? We need to protect the individual, in their security, in their income, and their needs from the natural environment, and the rest will follow.
The Supreme Court's decision on the Citizens United case has changed the manner in which money can influence elections. We are curious who has helped fund your campaign, as well as how much you estimate it will cost to run after the votes are cast on November 8th.
Sure, I can tell you quite clearly that if after November 8th, we will have raised and spent somewhere around $10,000, and it's all been raised by individuals who are giving us $20, $50, $100, in a few cases $500, but not very many cases of that. On the other hand, the incumbent has raised almost $100,000, and a good amount of that money, and this is available on websites that monitor that from the state government. A fair amount of money has come from out of state. So you have to ask yourself, okay, what do out of state people want with an assembly person from Wisconsin? And the answer is, they want special consideration on bills that affect the businesses that they're involved with. Citizens United was a terrible decision. The Republicans for some time, starting with Ronald Reagan, have been talking about the need for Supreme Court justices that are what they call strict constructionists. In other words, somehow these people, because of their education and experience, have an insight into what the Founding Fathers meant when they wrote the Constitution. Well, I mean, if you believe that, you probably can, you'll find somebody who will sell you a bridge in New York that doesn't go anywhere. I don't think anybody knows exactly what the Founding Fathers were thinking when they wrote the Constitution, but I'm fairly secure in my education on those issues that they did not believe that corporations were equivalent to people and that money was equivalent to free speech. I think they would be rolling over in their tombs at this point with that decision, and yet the Citizens United decision opened the door for big money to come in and influence elections. When somebody gives a PAC $10,000 or $100,000, I bet even at your young age, you won't believe that they don't expect some consideration. And that's what bothers me, is we need to get big money out of the election process if we're going to have people in office that serve you and I as citizens.
Is there any way for people to find more information on you or even to contact you?
Oh, sure. The literature that I hand out regularly, we were walking in Nakusa yesterday, putting information indoors and things like that, includes my telephone number, my email address, my Facebook page, and my web address. And the web address is holbrookforassembly.com. I think I've done a fairly decent job of talking about the issues and how I feel about those.
Thank you, Mr. Holbrook, for taking the time out of your busy day to have us interview. It has been a great pleasure.
It's been my pleasure as well. I'm glad you called. As a longtime educator, it's wonderful to see this kind of thing happening in our high schools, and I hope it's happening in all of our high schools. You're the next generation. You're the people that are going to pick up the baton and carry it forward. You know, I mean, one of the objections I had to running all along was, I'll be 70 years old in 3 months. My time has passed. I mean, there ought to be people in their 20s and 30s and 40s who are, you know, willing to step forward. And I know it takes courage to do that because it's a grueling process. But, you know, any decision I make today is not probably as well thought out as someone who still has 20 or 30 years left. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you for watching. We have contacted Krug and Vandermeer, but they have yet to respond. If they would like to contact us, you can use the information below.